Have you ever studied English for years, passed exams, completed grammar exercises, memorized vocabulary lists, and still felt completely unprepared for a real conversation? If your answer is yes, I want you to know something right away. You're not broken. You're not stupid. You're not bad at languages. You may simply have learned English in a way that prepared you for school, but not for real life. And that difference matters a lot, because many English learners around the world have the same experience. They spend years in classrooms. They learn verb tenses. They learn grammar rules. They learn how to complete exercises. They learn how to choose the correct answer. They learn how to pass tests. And then one day, they meet a real person, a coworker, a tourist, a customer, a friend, someone online, someone in a meeting, and suddenly, the English they learned in school doesn't feel enough. Not because it was useless, not because the teachers were bad, not because grammar doesn't matter, but because real communication is very different from classroom English. In school, English often feels organized, controlled, predictable. There is a question, there is an answer, there is a rule, there is a correct option. There is usually enough time to think, but real conversations are not like that. Real conversations move. They change direction. People interrupt themselves. People use incomplete sentences. People speak with emotion. People speak too fast. People use expressions you never saw in a textbook. People say things like, you know what I mean? Kind of, sort of. I was like, actually, never mind. Anyway, so basically, and if you only learned English from perfect textbook sentences, real English can feel chaotic. It can feel messy. It can feel unfair. You might think, why don't people speak the way I learned? Why does this sound so different? Why can I understand exercises but not real conversations? And that's exactly what we want to talk about today. Because the English you learned in school may have given you a foundation, but if you want to speak naturally, understand real people, and feel comfortable in real conversations, you need a different kind of practice. You need English that moves, English that breathes, English that sounds like real life. I remember when I first noticed this difference. I could understand written English pretty well. I could read instructions. I could understand grammar explanations. I could even complete exercises correctly. But when I listened to real conversations, I felt lost. Not completely lost, but uncomfortable. People didn't speak in clean textbook sentences. They connected words. They shortened phrases. They skipped things. They laughed in the middle of sentences. They changed topics before I was ready. And the frustrating part was that when I looked at the transcript later, I knew most of the words. That was the confusing part. The vocabulary wasn't impossible. The grammar wasn't impossible. The problem was that real English sounded different from the English I had practiced. And that realization changed everything for me, because I stopped blaming myself. I stopped thinking, my English is terrible. And I started thinking, maybe I need to train for the kind of English people actually use. That's a completely different mindset. If you train for exams, you become better at exams. If you train for grammar exercises, you become better at grammar exercises. If you train for conversations, you become better at conversations. It sounds obvious, but many learners never make that shift. They keep trying to solve a speaking problem with more grammar exercises. They keep trying to solve a listening problem by reading more rules. They keep trying to solve a confidence problem by waiting until they feel perfect. But real communication doesn't work that way. Real communication improves through exposure, through repetition, through listening to natural speech, through speaking before you're completely ready, through noticing patterns, through making mistakes, through becoming comfortable with imperfection. So in this episode, Laura and I are not here to tell you that school English is bad. That's not the point. School English can help. Grammar can help. Vocabulary can help. Structure can help. But if your goal is to speak English naturally, you need to go beyond classroom English. You need to learn how people actually communicate. And the good news is this: you don't need to start from zero. You already have a foundation. Now we just need to make that foundation alive.
Jordan, I smiled when you said that because I think almost every English learner has lived through that exact experience. I know I have. For years, I honestly believed that if I could answer grammar questions correctly, I was becoming a better English speaker. Every good grade made me feel more confident. Every completed exercise made me think I was making real progress. Every vocabulary test felt like another step toward fluency. And don't get me wrong, those things weren't useless. They helped me build a foundation. They taught me discipline. They introduced me to the language. But there was one problem. Nobody told me that knowing English and using English are two very different things. I still remember one of my first real conversations with a native speaker. I had studied for years. I knew the grammar. I knew the verb tenses. I knew hundreds of vocabulary words. I had filled notebooks with notes. I had completed countless exercises, so I thought I was ready. Then the conversation started. The first few seconds went well. I understood the greeting. I answered confidently. Then the person asked another question, a completely normal question, nothing complicated. But they didn't say it the way my textbook would have said it. They spoke naturally. They connected words together. They smiled while talking. They spoke a little faster than I expected. And suddenly my confidence disappeared. I remember thinking, wait, what did they just say? Not because my English was terrible, but because it didn't sound like classroom English anymore. It sounded alive. And that's something I wish teachers explained more often. Real English is alive. People hesitate. They laugh. They interrupt themselves. They change their minds halfway through a sentence. Sometimes they don't even finish the sentence. They expect you to understand from the context. That never happened in my English textbook. Every sentence was complete. Every dialogue was perfectly organized. Every conversation had a beginning, a middle, and an ending. Real conversations are much messier than that. And honestly, that's what makes them beautiful. They're human. They're spontaneous. They're imperfect. Once I understood that, something inside me changed. I stopped trying to sound like a textbook. I started trying to sound like a person. That may sound like a small difference, but it completely changed the way I learned English. Instead of memorizing perfect sentences, I started listening to real conversations. Instead of focusing only on grammar, I started paying attention to rhythm, to pauses, to expressions, to the little words people repeat all the time. Words like well, so, actually, I mean, those tiny expressions were almost invisible in the classroom, but they were everywhere in real life. Another thing I discovered was that native speakers don't seem worried about speaking perfectly. Sometimes they restart a sentence. Sometimes they correct themselves. Sometimes they search for a word. Sometimes they laugh because they forgot what they wanted to say, and nobody thinks that's strange. That's just communication. Meanwhile, many English learners believe they have to sound perfect before they deserve to speak. I definitely believe that. Looking back, I think I put much more pressure on myself than native speakers ever did. I was trying to sound like an English textbook. They were simply trying to have a conversation. Those are two completely different goals. Today, if someone asked me whether they should stop studying grammar, my answer would be no. Grammar matters. Vocabulary matters. Learning matters. But don't stop there. Take what you learn in the classroom and bring it into the real world. Listen to podcasts. Watch interviews. Have conversations. Make mistakes. Notice how people actually communicate. Because the moment English stops feeling like a school subject and starts feeling like a way to connect with people, that's the moment your learning becomes something much bigger than passing an exam. It becomes part of your life.
Laura, I think one of the biggest differences between classroom English and real English is the goal. Nobody really talks about that. In school, the goal is usually to be correct. In real life, the goal is to be understood. Those two goals sound similar, but they lead to completely different behaviors. When you're preparing for an exam, you're thinking about accuracy. Did I use the correct tense? Did I choose the correct preposition? Did I remember the grammar rule? Did I spell the word correctly? Every answer is evaluated. Every mistake has consequences. And after years of that experience, something happens. You begin to believe that speaking English is a test. Every conversation feels like another exam. Every sentence feels like it has to be perfect. Every mistake feels like losing points. But conversations don't work that way. Imagine you're having dinner with a friend. They're telling you about their vacation. Halfway through the story, they stop. They forget a word. They laugh. They change the sentence. They use a different expression. Do you interrupt them and say, "Sorry, your grammar wasn't perfect"? Of course not. You're listening to the story. You're listening to the emotion. You're listening because you want to connect with another person. That's what communication really is. Connection, not perfection. And yet millions of English learners are still carrying around the invisible pressure of the classroom. I used to do exactly the same thing. Before answering a simple question, I would edit my sentence inside my head. I'd think, no, That tense isn't right. Maybe I should use another word. That sentence sounds too simple. Meanwhile, the conversation had already moved on. The opportunity was gone. Not because I didn't know English, but because I was trying to sound like a textbook instead of sounding like myself. One day I decided to try something different. Instead of asking, "Is this sentence perfect?" I asked, "Will this person understand me?" That single question changed the way I communicated. Suddenly, I stopped searching for the perfect sentence. I started searching for a clear sentence. Those aren't the same thing. A clear sentence builds conversations. A perfect sentence often stays trapped inside your head. Something else I noticed is that native speakers rarely stop a conversation to admire grammar. Nobody says, "Wow, your present perfect was outstanding." Nobody cares. They care about your idea, your opinion, your experience, your sense of humor, your story. That's what people remember. In fact, think about your own language. How often do you notice perfect grammar during a conversation? Almost never, because your brain isn't listening for grammar. It's listening for meaning. That's exactly what people are doing when they listen to your English. They're trying to understand you, not evaluate you. I think many learners would improve much faster if they stop treating every conversation like a final exam. Conversations are not exams. They're practice. Every conversation teaches you something. Every conversation makes the next one easier. Every conversation helps your brain become more comfortable with the language. And that's something a classroom can never fully recreate. A classroom gives you knowledge. Real conversations transform that knowledge into confidence. That's why I always tell learners this. Keep studying. Keep learning grammar. Keep expanding your vocabulary. Those things absolutely matter. But don't let the classroom become your final destination. Take everything you learned there and bring it into the real world, because English was never meant to stay inside a textbook. It was meant to help people understand each other. And that's where the real learning begins.
Jordan, I think what you just said explains something that confused me for a very long time. I couldn't understand why I felt confident in the classroom but nervous everywhere else. It almost felt like I was speaking two different versions of English. One version belonged to school, the other belonged to real life. In the classroom, I knew exactly what was expected. The teacher asked a question. I had time to think. I organized my answer. I remembered the grammar rule. I spoke carefully. Everything happened in a controlled environment. Even when I made mistakes, I knew someone would stop me, explain the correction, and give me another opportunity. There was a certain sense of safety, but outside the classroom, none of that existed. Conversations didn't wait for me. People didn't slow down because I was translating in my head. Nobody paused the discussion so I could remember the correct verb tense. Life simply kept moving. At first, I thought that meant I wasn't ready. I believed I needed another course, another grammar book, another year of studying. But eventually, I realized something that completely changed my perspective. The problem wasn't that I needed more preparation. The problem was that I had never practiced spontaneous communication. Those are two very different skills. I remember the first time someone asked me a question I wasn't expecting. It wasn't difficult. Actually, it was one of the simplest questions imaginable. What do you usually do on weekends? I knew every single word in that sentence. Every single one. If you had written the question on a piece of paper, I would have understood it immediately. But hearing it naturally in a real conversation caught me by surprise. My mind froze. Not because I didn't know English, because I wasn't used to thinking in English while another person was waiting for my answer. That was something school had never taught me. School taught me how to answer. Real life expected me to respond. There's a subtle difference there. An answer can be prepared. A response often has to happen in the moment. And that's where conversation becomes a completely different experience. Another thing I noticed is that textbooks often make conversations look much smoother than they really are. Two people speak. One finishes. The other responds perfectly. Nobody interrupts. Nobody changes the subject. Nobody says, "Wait, what was I saying?" Nobody laughs because they forgot a word. Nobody starts a sentence and then decides to explain it differently. But that's exactly what real conversations sound like. They're full of little imperfections. And once I started paying attention to native speakers, I realized they do those things constantly. Sometimes they pause for several seconds. Sometimes they repeat the same word 3 times. Sometimes they say, "Let me think," or "How can I explain this?" or "That's not exactly what I meant." And nobody finds that strange. It's simply part of speaking. That realization took an enormous amount of pressure off my shoulders because I stopped believing that fluency meant speaking perfectly. I started understanding that fluency often means feeling comfortable, even when communication isn't perfect. Today, when someone tells me they're afraid of speaking because they don't sound like the dialogues in their English book, I always smile, because real conversations don't sound like textbooks. They sound like people. People who think, people who hesitate, people who laugh, people who change ideas halfway through a sentence, people who communicate naturally. And honestly, I think that's wonderful, because it means we don't have to become perfect speakers. We simply have to become real communicators. The classroom gave us an important foundation, but real life teaches us something even more valuable: how to connect with another human being through language. And in the end, that's what English was always meant to do.
Laura, there's another lesson I wish every English classroom taught. Not another grammar rule, not another list of irregular verbs, something much more practical. I wish someone had taught me what to do when I didn't know a word, because sooner or later, every English learner reaches that moment. You're having a conversation. Everything is going well. You're relaxed. You're following the discussion. Then suddenly, one word disappears. You know exactly what you want to say. You can see the idea clearly in your mind. But the English word simply isn't there. And for many learners, that's the end of the conversation. They freeze, they panic, they apologize, or they become completely silent. I know that feeling because I've experienced it many times. Years ago, I believed that forgetting one word meant I couldn't continue speaking. It felt like the conversation had reached a dead end. But one day I noticed something interesting. Native speakers forget words too. Have you ever noticed that? They're speaking their own language, and suddenly they stop. They say things like, "What's the word I'm looking for? How do you call that thing?" You know, the thing you use for, or, "I can't remember the name." And somehow, the conversation continues. Nobody panics. Nobody walks away. People simply help each other. That's what communication looks like. It's collaborative. It's not a competition. That completely changed the way I approached speaking English. Instead of thinking, "I must know every word," I started thinking, "I just need another way to explain the idea." That one shift made speaking much less stressful. Imagine you forget the word umbrella. Does the conversation have to stop? Not at all. You can say, "It's the thing you use when it rains." Maybe you forget the word refrigerator. You can say, "The place where we keep food cold." Maybe you forget the word necklace. You can say, "It's jewelry that you wear around your neck." Are those explanations perfect? No. Do they communicate the idea? Absolutely. And honestly, that's exactly what fluent speakers do all the time. They don't always search for the perfect word. They adapt, they describe, they simplify. They keep the conversation moving. That's a communication skill. And strangely enough, it's a skill that many classrooms never teach. Instead, we often learn that forgetting a word is failure. But forgetting a word isn't failure. Stopping the conversation because of one forgotten word, that's the habit we want to change. Another thing I wish someone had told me earlier is that conversations are incredibly forgiving. People usually understand much more than we think. They use context. They use body language. They use facial expressions. They use the topic you're discussing. Communication is happening in many different ways at the same time. It's not just individual vocabulary words. Sometimes learners imagine conversations as fragile, as if one missing word will cause everything to collapse. But real conversations are surprisingly flexible. People fill in the gaps. People ask questions. People clarify. People guess what you mean. And most of the time, they're happy to do it. Because that's what humans naturally do when they communicate. Looking back, I realized that school trained me to search for perfect answers. Real life taught me to search for understandable answers. Those are very different goals. Today, if I forget a word while speaking English, I don't see it as a disaster anymore. I see it as an opportunity to become more creative, to explain, to describe, to keep communicating. Ironically, that's often how we become better speakers, not by avoiding difficult moments, but by learning how to move through them with confidence. Because at the end of the day, nobody remembers whether you knew one specific vocabulary word. People remember whether they enjoyed talking with you, and that's a much better goal than trying to sound perfect every single time.
Jordan, I think this entire conversation can be summarized with one simple realization. School teaches us how to learn a language. Life teaches us how to live in that language. And those are not the same experience. Looking back, I'm actually grateful for the English I learned in school. It gave me a starting point. It introduced me to grammar. It helped me understand sentence structure. It gave me vocabulary. Without that foundation, this journey would have been much harder. So this isn't about rejecting what we learned. It's about recognizing that it was only the beginning. For many years, I thought finishing an English course meant I should already feel fluent. When I didn't, I assumed I had failed. Now, I understand that finishing a course simply means you're ready to begin using the language in real life. That's a completely different perspective. I also wish more learners understood that discomfort is not a sign of failure. It's often a sign of growth. The first time you have a real conversation in English, you'll probably feel uncomfortable. The second conversation might still feel awkward. The 10th conversation will probably feel better. The 100th conversation will feel completely different. Not because you suddenly became smarter, but because your brain adapted. That's what human beings do. We adapt. The more we experience something, the more natural it becomes. I sometimes compare language learning to learning how to drive. At first, every movement feels intentional. You think about the mirrors, the pedals, the steering wheel, the speed, the traffic. Everything demands your attention. Then, little by little, your brain starts connecting the pieces. Months later, you're driving while talking to a friend, listening to music and enjoying the scenery. Not because driving became easier, because you became more familiar with it. Speaking English follows the same pattern. In the beginning, every sentence requires effort. Every conversation feels like hard work. Every mistake feels important. But with enough real experience, something beautiful happens. The language slowly becomes part of you. You stop translating every thought. You stop worrying about every grammar rule. You stop trying to sound perfect. You simply focus on the person in front of you. And I honestly believe that's when communication becomes meaningful, not when your English becomes perfect. When your attention shifts away from yourself and toward the other person, because that's what conversations have always been about. They're not performances. They're relationships. They're curiosity. They're shared experiences. They're moments that connect two human beings. If you've been feeling frustrated because your classroom English doesn't seem enough, I hope today's conversation gives you a different perspective. Don't throw away everything you've learned. Use it, build on it, trust it. But don't keep it trapped inside notebooks and grammar exercises. Take it outside. Use it in cafes. Use it at work. Use it while traveling. Use it with friends. Use it with strangers. Use it even when your voice shakes a little, even when you make mistakes, even when you have to explain a word instead of remembering it. Because every real conversation teaches you something no textbook ever could. And maybe that's the biggest lesson of all. English was never meant to help you pass a test. It was meant to help you understand another person and to help another person understand you. That's a much more meaningful goal. So if you're listening today and wondering whether you're ready to start speaking English, my answer is simple. You probably became ready much earlier than you think. Now all that's left is to believe it